They say the silence of space is absolute. But when 10,000 warships eclipse your sun, the silence sounds exactly like a suffocating gasp. The skies above Ethelgard, the shining capital world of the Galactic Alliance, had been stripped of their brilliant azure. In their place hung a jagged iron-gray canopy of dreadnoughts, cruisers, and orbital siege platforms. Warlord Kalen Vor had arrived, not with diplomats but with an armada forged in the brutal foundries of the Outer Rim. His flagship, a monolithic vessel resembling a floating obsidian dagger, cast a shadow that literally and metaphorically swallowed the Senate spire whole. Inside the Grand Chamber, the air was thick with the scent of panic and expensive cologne. The High Chancellor, a man who had built a career on eloquent speeches and empty promises, was visibly trembling at his podium. Floating in the center of the amphitheater was a massive holographic projection of Warlord Vor. The Warlord did not posture or shout. He spoke with the terrifying, quiet resonance of a man who held the power to crack a planet in half and was merely deciding if it was worth the effort. Vor's demand was simple. The Alliance would surrender their rumored doomsday project, classified under the code name Zenith. In exchange, he would spare the 70 billion civilians cowering on the continent below. If they refused, he would scorch the atmosphere until Ethelgard was nothing but a floating cinder. He gave them 2 hours. The Senate erupted into a chaotic cacophony of terror. Politicians screamed at one another, their perfectly manicured facades crumbling under the weight of imminent annihilation. They argued about fleet redeployments that would take days, about defensive shields that would last minutes, about surrender terms that Vor would simply ignore. Through this storm of cowardice walked Ambassador Lyra Thorne. Lyra was a study in absolute composure. Her sharp, tailored uniform was immaculate, her posture rigid, her eyes a startling, icy blue that seemed to cut right through the hysterical atmosphere. She marched directly to the Chancellor's podium, silencing the panicked babble around her through sheer, magnetic force of will. "We will give him exactly what he is asking for," Lyra stated, her voice projecting clearly across the chamber without the aid of a microphone. The Chancellor stared at her, a bead of sweat tracing the contour of his jaw. "Ambassador Thorne, you cannot be serious. Zenith is not a piece of hardware we can just load onto a cargo skiff. It is highly volatile, it is uncontainable, and more importantly, it hates us." "That," Lyra replied, a dark, calculating edge to her tone, "is precisely why we are giving him to Vor." Far away from the opulent halls of the capital, in the freezing, absolute dark of a classified orbital black site known as Tartarus Station, a man sat perfectly still on a steel slab. His name was Elias Vance. Once, he had been the Alliance's most decorated Black Ops operative, an instrument of surgical precision and unwavering loyalty. Now, he was a ghost haunting his own body. He wore a simple gray isolation suit that hung loosely on his muscular, heavily scarred frame. The cell contained no bed, no light, no warmth, just the humming vibration of the station's life support systems and the suffocating pressure of 1 billion tons of vacuum outside the hull. Elias did not pace. He did not speak. He simply existed in a state of profound, impenetrable apathy. The Senate had taken everything from him to forge their perfect weapon. They had determined that a soldier with a family was a soldier with a vulnerability. So, they orchestrated a tragic, unavoidable accident. A localized orbital strike on a civilian sector. A tragic misfire. Elias knew the truth. He had seen the classified requisition logs. He knew the politicians who had signed the order to incinerate his wife and daughter just to ensure his mind was utterly devoid of distraction. When he discovered the betrayal, he did not weep. He systematically dismantled the Senate's internal security division. snapping the necks of 3 generals before the shock troops finally managed to bring him down with enough neurotoxin to kill a Leviathan. Instead of executing him, they buried him here. A weapon too dangerous to wield, too expensive to destroy. The heavy, magnetically sealed door of his cell shrieked as it ground open. Blinding, artificial light spilled into the room, cutting a harsh geometric shape across the frost-covered floor. Elias did not flinch or shield his eyes. He slowly turned his head, his gaze flat and dead. Lyra Thorne stepped into the cell. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The air grew impossibly heavy, charged with the crackling static of an unresolved, violent history. Years ago, before the fire, before the betrayal, before the absolute darkness of Tartarus Station, there had been a fiery, passionate entanglement between them. They had been 2 rising stars in a corrupt system, finding solace in the brief moments they could steal together in the shadows. But when the Senate ordered the strike on Elias's home, Lyra had chosen her career. She had known about the operation and had remained silent, rationalizing that the survival of the Republic outweighed the life of one family. It was a choice that had haunted her every waking second, a choice she saw reflected in the terrifying emptiness of Elias's eyes. "You look well, Elias," Lyra said. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the datapad in her hands. Elias simply stared at her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. He noted the slight tremor in her posture, the way her eyes refused to linger on the jagged scar running along his jawline. "They sent you." Elias finally spoke. His voice was a rasping scrape of rusted metal, ruined from years of disuse. "That means they are desperate. The capital is burning." "Not yet," Lyra replied, taking a tentative step forward. "Warlord Vor has blockaded Ethelgard. He has a planetary siege grid locked onto the major population centers. He wants you, Elias. He believes Zenith is a mechanized doomsday device, a superweapon capable of leveling fleets." A dark, humorless smirk touched the corner of Elias's mouth. "And you are going to correct his misconception. I am going to wrap you in a bow and hand you over to him," Lyra said, her icy facade cracking just enough to reveal the desperate gamble beneath. "The Chancellor is terrified. The military is paralyzed. Vor expects a machine he can reverse engineer. He expects technology he can torture out of a databank. He does not expect a human being." "I am not a human being," Elias said quietly. "Not anymore. Your friends in the Senate made sure of that." Lyra swallowed hard, the guilt flashing violently behind her eyes before she forced it back down. "I know. And that is exactly why this will work. You are going to be our Trojan horse." She activated the datapad, casting a dim blue schematic between them. It showed the internal layout of Kalen Vor's dreadnought, a labyrinth of armor plating, security checkpoints, and energy conduits. "We are going to surrender you to Vor," Lyra explained, her tone dropping into a rapid, tactical cadence. "We will tell him that you are a biologically engineered weapon, that your mind is a quantum vault containing the activation codes for a system-wide defense grid. It is a lie he will want to believe. He will take you aboard his flagship. He will isolate you. He will try to break you." Elias looked at the holographic projection, his dead eyes reflecting the blue light. "He can try. He will use telepathic interrogators, neuro-whips, sensory deprivation," Lyra warned, stepping closer, desperately searching for a flicker of the man she once knew. "But you have nothing left to break. Elias, you have no fear, no hope, no attachments. You are a void. When they realize they cannot extract anything from you, they will get sloppy. That is when you will tear his ship apart from the inside out." Elias tilted his head, regarding her like a strange, unfamiliar insect. You want me to save the very people who murdered my family, the people who locked me in a box. I am asking you to kill the man who is about to slaughter 70 billion innocents, Lyra countered, her voice rising with sudden, fierce intensity. I am giving you a target, Elias, a playground where every single living, breathing thing is an enemy. I am giving you a purpose. Elias slowly stood up. He towered over her, a massive coiled spring of suppressed violence. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could smell the ozone and stale recycled air clinging to his skin. If I do this, Elias whispered, the menace in his voice absolute. If I somehow manage to crack that warlord's fortress and snap his neck, I am not coming back to be put in a cage, and I will not forget who put me there in the first place. Lyra held her ground, refusing to look away. Before we hand you over, medical is going to put you through a sync process. They are going to install something inside you, something that ensures Vor's fleet will never leave this system. Elias's eyes narrowed, catching a glimpse of a terrible hidden truth behind Lyra's desperate gaze. A silver scalpel gliding through flesh is a quiet thing, but the betrayal it carried echoed like thunder in the sterile medical bay. Elias Vance lay strapped to an angled surgical slab in the deepest sub-level of Tartarus Station. Above him, a halo of blinding surgical lamps washed out the grim faces of 3 Alliance biotechnicians. They wore heavy lead-lined aprons and sealed rebreathers, treating him less like a patient and more like an unexploded piece of ordnance. Because the biosync procedure required active, conscious neural pathways to weave the hardware into his nervous system. General anesthesia was entirely out of the question. The lead technician, a pale man with sweat completely fogging his visor, inserted a micro-drill into the base of Elias's skull. The vibration rattled through Elias's jaw, followed by a sharp, blinding spike of agony as the drill bit found the sensitive cluster of nerves wrapped around his upper spine. You missed a spot, Elias grunted, his voice a gravelly whisper perfectly devoid of distress. A little to the left and you could have paralyzed my diaphragm. Would save the Chancellor a lot of paperwork. The technician's hand trembled, causing the drill to slip a millimeter. A fresh wave of white-hot pain washed over Elias. He did not scream. He simply smiled, a terrifying baring of teeth that made the 2 assisting nurses take a collective step backward. "Ignore him," the lead technician stammered, his voice thin and reedy through the comms unit. "I just prepped the Zenith core. The Senate wants this finalized before the Armada enters low orbit." One of the nurses carefully lifted a cylindrical object from a stasis cooler. It was no larger than a thumb, glowing with a sickly iridescent green light. This was the Zenith core. It was a marvel of black market bioengineering, a hyper-dense explosive charge laced with a synthetic neural mesh. Once implanted, it would graft itself directly to Elias's brainstem, virtually undetectable by standard medical scanners. "Tell me," Elias said, his eyes tracking the glowing cylinder as it moved toward his exposed neck. "Did the Senate give you a bulk discount on the explosive, or did they spring for the premium package? I would hate to vaporize half a dreadnought and leave the dining room intact." "The yield is sufficient to core a small moon," the technician replied tersely, eager to finish the job. "And it is linked to a quantum-encrypted kill switch. Do not think you can cut it out." "Vance, the casing is laced with biometric sensors. Your heart rate drops. It detonates. You try to tamper with the casing. It detonates." Elias felt the cold, metallic pressure of the core sliding into the cavity they had carved into his flesh. The moment the synthetic mesh made contact with his spinal cord, a shockwave of absolute mind-shattering cold violently seized his body. His back arched against the heavy leather restraints, muscles straining to the point of tearing. He could feel the artificial tendrils of the device snaking through his nervous system, hijacking his biology, anchoring itself to his very soul. Through the haze of pain, Elias noticed a secondary blinking module the technician was attaching to the primary core. The man muttered something under his breath to the nurse about a localized fail-safe frequency, an override code that bypassed standard Alliance military channels. The implication hung heavily in the freezing air. Someone else was holding a detonator, someone outside the official chain of command. An hour later, the pain had subsided to a dull, constant throb at the base of his skull. Elias stood in the airlock of a sleek, unarmed Alliance diplomatic cutter. He was dressed in a simple, dark utility uniform. Heavy magnetic shackles bound his wrists, though both he and the armed guards flanking him knew the restraints were purely theatrical. Lyra Thorne stood by the viewport, her arms crossed, watching the imposing mass of Warlord Kalen Vor's dreadnought grow larger. The enemy flagship was a terrifying monument to violence. Unlike the smooth white curves of Alliance vessels, Vor's ship was a jagged mountain of dark, unpolished iron and dense armor plating. Massive weapon batteries bristled along its spine, and the hull was painted with the rust-colored ashes of conquered worlds. The cutter shuddered as the dreadnought's tractor beam caught them, pulling the tiny vessel into a cavernous, dimly lit hangar bay. "This is the line, Elias," Lyra said quietly, not looking away from the viewport. "Once that airlock opens, you belong to him. I haven't belonged to anyone since the day your people burned my world to ash," Elias replied. His voice was flat, carrying no anger, only the chilling weight of absolute certainty. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy, metallic thud. The massive blast doors of the cutter hissed open, revealing a reception party of heavily armored shock troops holding high-yield plasma rifles. At their center stood Warlord Kalen Vor. Vor was a mountain of a man, clad in deeply scarred crimson and gold armor that looked equal parts ceremonial and highly functional. He possessed a sharp, patrician face framed by a mane of silver hair, his eyes burning with the shrewd, calculating intelligence of a predator who had never known defeat. He looked past Lyra, past the guards, his gaze sweeping the interior of the cutter in search of his prize. Lyra stepped down the ramp, her chin held high, projecting the supreme confidence of a seasoned diplomat walking into a viper's nest. Elias was shoved down the ramp behind her by his guards, his magnetic shackles clanking loudly in the cavernous silence of the hangar. "Ambassador Thorne," Vor's voice boomed, rich and resonant. "I must admit, your Senate capitulated far faster than I anticipated. I expected at least a token resistance, perhaps a dramatic speech about the indomitable spirit of the Republic. The Alliance values the lives of its citizens above foolish pride, Warlord." Lyra lied smoothly. "We have brought you Zenith." Vor frowned, his heavy brow furrowing as he looked around the empty ramp. "Where is it? Is it in the cargo hold?" "I assumed a weapon capable of altering the balance of galactic power would require a stasis transport." Lyra took a step to the side, gesturing to the silent, heavily scarred man standing behind her. "He is Zenith." Vor stared at Elias. He looked at the dull, gray uniform, the metal restraints, the profound, empty deadness in Elias's eyes. A moment of absolute silence stretched across the hangar bay before Vor threw his head back and unleashed a booming, genuine laugh. "This is your doomsday weapon?" Vor asked, stepping closer to inspect Elias as one might inspect a remarkably ugly piece of livestock. "A broken soldier who looks like he survived a trip through a plasma turbine?" I demanded the pinnacle of Alliance military engineering. Ambassador, not your cast-offs. You demanded our deadliest asset, and he is standing before you." Lyra maintained, her voice dropping to a serious, conspiratorial tone. "Elias Vance is a biological cipher. His mind contains the quantum-encrypted architectural blueprints and the activation codes for our entire planetary defense network. The data is locked behind layers of artificially induced trauma and neurobarriers. He is the key to our defenses. Warlord, we could not destroy him without destroying the codes, and we could not hide him from you. Vor circled Elias, his sharp eyes taking in the rigid posture, the terrifying lack of micro-expressions. Fascinating, Vor murmured. You break your own hounds to protect your sheep. The hypocrisy of the Alliance never fails to entertain me. Vor stopped directly in front of Elias, leaning in close. Do you speak weapon? Elias looked at the warlord. He did not blink. He did not show an ounce of intimidation. Only when I have something worth saying. Vor smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. I like him. He has the stench of a man who has already died once. The warlord waved a dismissive hand at Lyra. You have delivered the prize, Ambassador. Your capital will be spared my wrath for today. Take your ship and run back to your trembling politicians. Lyra nodded once, a crisp, professional bow. She turned back toward the ramp of her cutter. As she passed Elias, she paused for a fraction of a second. She did not speak, but she met his eyes. In that brief, silent exchange, the carefully constructed walls of the hardened diplomat crumbled just an inch. Elias saw the agonizing weight of her regret, a ghost of the fiery woman he had once loved, and a desperate, silent plea for him to survive. Elias gave her nothing. He looked right through her, letting her carry her guilt alone. Lyra swallowed hard, broke the connection, and marched up the ramp. The airlock hissed shut, sealing away the only familiar face in a galaxy of enemies. As the Alliance cutter detached and drifted out of the hangar, the amused smile vanished from Kalen Vor's face, replaced by a mask of ruthless, cold efficiency. Take him to the interrogation matrix. Vor commanded his guards, his voice devoid of the theatrical charm he had shown Lyra. Strip his mind bare. I want those defense codes by nightfall. If he resists, burn away his sanity until there is nothing left but the data. Two massive shock troops grabbed Elias by the arms, dragging him out of the hangar and into the dark, labyrinthine bowels of the dreadnought. They descended through levels of grinding machinery and shouting soldiers, the air growing hotter and thicker with the smell of ozone and fear. They finally threw him into a circular, windowless room composed entirely of black, reflective metal. In the center sat a heavy mechanical chair surrounded by a complex array of sensory manipulation equipment and telepathic interface spikes. The room hummed with a low, oppressive frequency that vibrated directly against the teeth. They slammed Elias into the chair, locking heavy metal clamps over his wrists, ankles, and chest. A technician in a dark uniform stepped forward, pulling a metallic halo lined with dozens of neuroconductive needles down toward Elias's skull. As the machine powered up, whining with a terrifying pitch, Elias felt the explosive core nestled against his spine pulse. It was a rhythmic, steady vibration, a silent countdown that he could not control, beating in time with a fail-safe signal held by an unknown hand in the dark. There is a very specific, lethal arrogance in assuming you can break a man whose mind is already a graveyard. The interrogators aboard Kalen Vor's flagship were about to learn that prying into Elias Vance's head was less like picking a lock and more like swallowing glass. The dark technician activated the interrogation matrix. A searing bolt of pure, synthesized neural energy lanced directly into Elias's frontal lobe. The machine was designed to peel back consciousness layer by layer, bypassing a subject's willpower to project their deepest secrets onto a monitoring screen. A lesser man would have shattered instantly, begging for mercy before the second dial was turned. Elias simply retreated. He possessed an architecture of trauma so dense that it functioned as an impenetrable blast shelter for his mind. The interrogator, an Imperial telepath physically hooked into the machine's feedback loop, pushed deeper. He was hunting for the promised Alliance defense codes, expecting to find rigid firewalls, encrypted data clusters, and military algorithms. Instead, Elias let the invasive probe bypass his outer defenses, steering it away from the ticking explosive core nestled against his spine and threw the telepath directly into his most agonizing memory. Elias weaponized his own tragedy. He forced the interrogator to experience the exact moment the Alliance orbital strike incinerated his home. He flooded the telepath's sensory inputs with the blinding, searing heat of plasma fire, the crushing gravity of collapsing architecture, and the absolute suffocating despair of a man watching his world turn to ash. The telepath convulsed violently in his chair. He let out a blood-curdling scream, tearing the heavy neural link helmet from his own head. He collapsed to the iron floor, clutching his bleeding eyes, sobbing uncontrollably about falling skies and burning flesh. Warlord Kalen. Vor observed the spectacle from the threshold of the room, his expression darkening from detached amusement to profound irritation. He looked at Elias. The prisoner was still strapped heavily to the chair, his chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm, his face a perfectly calm mask of utter indifference. His mind is a sealed vault of localized madness, the head technician stammered, his hands shaking as he wiped a trail of blood from his fallen colleague's face. There are no defense codes on the surface. His neural pathways are entirely consumed by grief and rage. We would need weeks of continuous careful probing to peel back this level of psychological scar tissue. Vor did not have weeks. His armada was burning fuel and patience maintaining the blockade. He sneered, a terrifying curling of his upper lip that promised sudden violence. If you cannot open the vault smoothly, you must melt the hinges. Vor commanded, turning his back on the Matrix. Throw him into the lower decks. Put him in the iron pens. Let him learn the brutal arithmetic of survival at the bottom of my food chain. When he is broken, starving, bleeding, and begging for a merciful death, we will plug him back in. He will give me those codes just for a clean bandage. The guards unclasped Elias and dragged him out of the room, hauling him down through the dreadnought's massive circulatory system. The pristine, sterile environment of the command decks rapidly gave way to grating. Industrial walkways, leaking coolant lines, and the oppressive, suffocating heat of the main sublight engines. They reached the gladiator pens, a cavernous, multi-tiered holding area deep in the bowels of the ship. It was a pit of absolute Darwinian cruelty where Vor kept a menagerie of political prisoners, disgraced soldiers, and unfortunate captives to fight for the amusement of his crew. The air was thick with the stench of rust, sweat, and alien blood. The heavy iron gate slammed shut, the locking mechanism echoing like a gunshot. Elias stood in the center of the rusted arena, a lone figure in a dull gray uniform. The murmurs of 100 hardened criminals and alien brutes echoed from the shadows of the surrounding cells. They smelled fresh meat. They saw a man in restraints and assumed he was prey. The dominant force in this particular holding pen was a towering, heavily muscled alien convict. He possessed a cybernetic jaw, scales the color of dried mud, and arms as thick as engine pistons. He stepped out of the shadows and approached Elias with the heavy, deliberate strides of an apex predator. The brute raised a massive, plated fist, intending to establish the brutal hierarchy of the pens by crushing the new human skull with a single blow. Elias did not posture. He did not issue a verbal warning or raise his hands in defense. In the span of a single heartbeat, his mind calculated the brute's center of gravity, the lag time in his cheap cybernetic servos, and the exact tensile strength of the alien's exposed left knee joint. Elias moved with a fluid, terrifying economy of motion. He sidestepped the heavy telegraphing punch, driving the steel heel of his boot directly into the side of the brute's knee. He pivoted his weight perfectly. The joint gave way with a sickening, unnatural bend. As the giant collapsed forward, roaring in sudden agony, Elias used the creature's own downward momentum to drive a punishing elbow directly into its throat. The fight was over in less than 3 seconds. The giant hit the floor, suffocating and paralyzed, gasping for air that would not come. Elias did not celebrate. He did not look around to demand respect. He casually stepped over the massive, twitching body and walked to the darkest corner of the pen, taking a seat on the cold iron floor. Absolute silence descended upon the gladiator pens. The predatory hunger in the eyes of the other prisoners instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, primal dread. They recognized exactly what had just entered their cage. It was not a victim. It was an apex predator disguised as a broken man. Elias leaned his head back against the vibrating bulkhead and closed his eyes. He was not resting. He was hunting. He focused his mind, tuning out the harsh breathing of the terrified inmates. He felt the rhythmic thrumming of the dreadnought's massive plasma drives through the metal of the floor. He counted the exact seconds between the heavy footfalls of the armored security patrols on the catwalks above. He noted the slight, microscopic power fluctuations in the magnetic containment fields of the cell doors every 12 minutes. He was building a comprehensive, 3-dimensional schematic of the ship's lower quadrant entirely through sensory deduction and supreme tactical awareness. You have a very strange definition of relaxing, human. Elias opened his eyes. Standing a few feet away was a lanky, reptilian alien with iridescent, deep blue scales and a face that seemed permanently frozen in a cynical, mocking smirk. He wore a ragged, multi-pocketed smuggler's coat that had clearly seen better decades, and he held his forearms casually crossed over his chest. "The name is Jax," the alien said, sliding down the wall to sit near Elias, though maintaining a very careful, highly respectful distance. "I run contraband, mostly stolen engine parts, occasionally exotic liquors, sometimes fugitives. Caught a bad break at a border checkpoint and ended up in Vor's personal collection. I have seen a lot of raw meat thrown into this grinder. But I have never seen someone solve a physics problem by breaking a Warlord's champion in half." Elias ignored him, shifting his cold gaze to the heavy security cameras slowly sweeping across the pen. "Not much of a talker, that is fine. I can respect the strong, silent routine." Jax continued, completely unfazed by the icy reception. "But you are not just staring at the wall. You are measuring the camera sweeps. You are feeling the vibrations from the tertiary manifold right beneath us. You are looking for a door." Elias slowly turned his head. His dead, flat eyes locked onto the smuggler, pinning him in place like an insect on a board. "And what exactly do you know about the tertiary manifold?" Jax flashed a mouth full of needle-like teeth in a wide, dangerous grin. "I know that it routes directly to the primary exhaust vents of this deck. I also know that if someone were to subtly tamper with the pressure regulators inside that conduit, it would cause a localized, cascading power failure across this entire cell block. And most importantly, I know the numeric access code to the maintenance hatch hidden behind the latrine." Jax leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I can get us into the walls, human, but I cannot fight my way past the shock troops standing on the other side. You provide the muscle. I provide the map." A strange, highly pragmatic alliance was born in the shadows of the iron pens. Jax possessed the blueprints, the codes, and the cynical fast-talking required to navigate the ship's underbelly. Elias possessed the sheer, uncompromising violence required to execute the physical breach. It was a perfect, deadly synergy. Yet a silent, ticking problem remained hidden beneath Elias's skin. Deep within his spinal column, the zenith explosive core pulsed with a sudden, erratic rhythm. It was a secondary signal, a proximity warning pinging from a highly encrypted Alliance military channel. Someone far outside the dreadnought was actively testing the remote detonator. Elias realized the grim truth. The Senate was getting impatient. They were not going to wait for Vor to attack the capital. They were preparing to trigger the explosive early, turning Elias into a hyperspace bomb long before he could ever make an escape or disable the ship's drives. Elias leaned his head back against the cold iron wall, a grim, humorless smile finally touching his lips. He was trapped in a cage, buried inside a flying fortress, surrounded by an enemy armada, with a live, highly unstable warhead surgically grafted to his spine that was about to be triggered by his own government. It was exactly the kind of impossible odds he had been waiting for. Power has a distinct scent, a cloying mixture of aged wine and ozone that always precedes an invitation you cannot refuse. Elias Vance was pulled from the suffocating grime of the gladiator pens exactly 2 hours after shattering the reigning champion's knee. 4 of Warlord Vor's most heavily armored elite guards marched into the cell block, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at Elias's chest. They did not shout orders, they simply flanked him, treating him with the profound, terrified respect reserved for an unchained predator. As Elias was marched out of the iron gates, he locked eyes with Jax for a fraction of a second. The blue-scaled smuggler gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent confirmation that their precarious alliance was set in motion. Instead of being dragged back to the agonizing torture of the interrogation matrix, Elias was escorted to the very apex of the dreadnought. The rusted grating of the lower decks transitioned into polished obsidian floors and towering panoramic viewports displaying the captive, terrified jewel of Ethelgard hanging in the void below. The guards shoved Elias through a set of heavy blast doors into Warlord Kalen Vor's private dining quarters. The room was a staggering display of looted opulence, filled with priceless tapestries from burned worlds and a massive dining table carved from a single piece of dark, polished meteorite. Vor sat at the head of the table, cutting into a thick slab of deep red exotic meat. He gestured casually to the empty chair opposite him with his plasma-heated steak knife. "Sit, Vance," Vor commanded, his voice a rich, rumbling baritone devoid of its previous hostility. "A man who can dismantle a Vorkasian pit fighter in 3 seconds has earned a hot meal and my undivided attention." Elias sat. He did not touch the silver cutlery or the crystal goblet of deep purple wine placed before him. He simply watched the warlord, his posture rigid, his eyes mapping the room's blind spots and calculating the exact force required to drive a butter knife through Vor's armored jugular. "My interrogators tell me your mind is a fortress of localized madness," Vor said, taking a slow sip of his wine. "They say you are so deeply buried under layers of trauma that the Alliance defense codes are unreachable. But I watched the security footage from the pens. A madman does not calculate a perfectly executed joint strike. A madman thrashes. You, Elias, are terrifyingly lucid." Vor leaned forward, resting his massive elbows on the table, a charismatic, predatory gleam in his eye. "The Alliance sent you here as a sacrificial lamb, hoping your broken mind would buy them a few extra hours to evacuate their corrupt politicians. They threw you to the wolves. But I am not a wolf. Vance, I am a fire, and I know exactly what kind of fuel I am looking at." Elias remained silent, letting the warlord construct his own narrative. "I know who you were before they put you in that black site." Vor continued, his tone softening into something resembling genuine empathy. "I have my spies. I know about the orbital strike. I know about your family." The mention of his family did not cause Elias to flinch. The pain was too deep, too foundational to show on his face, but the memory surged violently to the forefront of his mind. He remembered the exact moment he had sliced into the Alliance High Command's secure servers. He remembered the cold, clinical language of the requisition order signed by the High Chancellor himself. The Senate had calculated that Elias's emotional attachments were hindering his lethal efficiency. His wife and daughter were not tragic collateral damage in a rebel skirmish. They were the subjects of a grotesque psychological experiment. The Alliance had authorized a surgical plasma bombardment on a civilian sector purely to forge Elias into a remorseless, unattached weapon. They had burned his universe to the ground just to sharpen his edge. They murdered everything you loved because they were terrified of what you could become if you were untethered, Vor stated, tracing the rim of his goblet. They broke you, and then, when they realized they could not control the monster they created, they locked you in a box. You and I are not so different, Vance. We are both products of the Senate's arrogance. We are both weapons forged by the hypocrisy of men in soft suits. Vor extended a massive, scarred hand across the table. I am not asking for your defense codes anymore. Keep them. The Alliance is going to burn regardless of their shields. I am offering you something far more valuable than survival. I am offering you a seat at the table. Help me dismantle the Republic, use my fleet, use my resources. Let us go down to Ethelgard and drag the Chancellor out of his ivory tower by his throat. I offer you absolute, unrestricted vengeance. It was a beautiful, compelling lie. Vor did not care about Elias's vengeance. He only cared about acquiring an unstoppable vanguard for his invasion force. But Elias recognized the tactical goldmine hidden within the Warlord's ego. Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He finally broke his silence, his voice a low, raspy scrape. Your planetary siege grid is flawed. Vor blinked, caught off guard by the sudden tactical pivot. Excuse me? Your dreadnoughts are maintaining a tight echelon formation in low orbit, Elias explained, his flat eyes locking onto Vor's. It is an intimidation tactic. But the Alliance orbital defense cannons operate on a synchronized, multi-spectrum targeting loop. If you keep your ships that close, a single overloaded thermal pulse from the planetary surface will chain react through your fleet's overlapping magnetic shields. You will lose 3 cruisers before you even launch a landing craft. You need to stagger your capital ships by a factor of 12 kilometers and decouple your shared shielding. Vor stared at Elias, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. He tapped a command sequence into his wristcom, verifying the tactical geometry Elias had just laid out. The Warlord's eyes widened slightly as the onboard computer confirmed the lethal vulnerability. Incredible, Vor whispered, highly amused. You just saved me 1 billion credits in hardware with a passing observation. Elias picked up the crystal goblet and took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. It was a calculated gesture of submission, a perfectly played pawn in a deadly game of chess. I do not care about your war, Vor, but I refuse to die because your admirals do not understand basic energy dispersion. The Warlord laughed, a booming sound that echoed off the obsidian walls. He had taken the bait. Vor believed he had cracked the impassable armor, believing that Elias's hatred for the Alliance was a leash he could hold. Guards, Vor barked, waving a hand toward the door. Give Mr. Vance a localized command cipher. Let him walk the primary command deck. If he tries to access the engineering bay or the armory, shoot him in the legs. Otherwise, treat him as an honored guest. The elite guards handed Elias a small metallic data chip, their expressions a mix of profound confusion and strict obedience. It was a localized clearance key, heavily restricted, but it was exactly the sliver of access Elias needed. An hour later, Elias was pacing the perimeter of the secondary command deck, flanked by two heavily armed minders. The deck was a hive of activity, filled with technicians monitoring the planetary blockade and coordinating troop movements. Elias walked with the slow, aimless gait of a defeated man, perfectly masking the hyper-focused calculation happening behind his eyes. He stopped near a secondary tactical terminal, ostensibly to observe a holographic map of the Alliance fleet's pathetic defensive posture. He leaned against the console, his body shielding his hands from the guard's line of sight. With lightning speed and surgical precision, Elias slipped the localized cipher into the terminal's access port. He bypassed Vor's basic security protocols and executed the hidden subroutine Jax had whispered to him in the gladiator pens. The smuggler's code acted as a digital skeleton key, slipping past the firewall and opening a direct encrypted channel to the Dreadnought's subspace communications array. Elias did not search for Vor's secrets. He searched for his own. He pinged the unique encrypted biometric signature of the Zenith core buried in his spine. He bounced the signal off a passing Alliance stealth buoy hanging invisibly on the edge of the system. The data flooded the small, hidden section of his screen. Elias read the telemetry, his heart rate remaining terrifyingly steady despite the horrific truth unfolding in the green text. The Alliance was not waiting. The encrypted command signal had already been sent from the Senate spire on Ethelgard. The politicians had realized that leaving Elias on the flagship was too much of a variable. They could not risk Vor extracting the defense codes, and they certainly could not risk Elias turning the Warlord's fleet against them. The High Chancellor had authorized the early detonation sequence. Elias looked at the tiny flashing countdown timer hidden in the raw data stream. The Zenith core was no longer waiting for a manual trigger. It had been activated on a delayed automated loop. He had exactly 90 minutes until the biosynthetic explosive grafted to his nervous system detonated with enough force to vaporize the entire upper quadrant of the Dreadnought, killing Vor, the command staff, and Elias himself. The Senate was treating him exactly as they always had. He was a disposable asset, a bomb to be dropped and forgotten. Elias calmly deleted the access log, wiped the screen, and slipped the cipher back into his pocket. He turned away from the console, his dead eyes meeting the visors of his two heavily armed guards. He had 90 minutes to find a way to perform impossible neurosurgery on himself. Blind, deep behind enemy lines, or he could finally let the fire consume him. A ticking clock is the only sound in the universe that can force a dead man to finally open his eyes. Elias Vance had exactly 89 minutes left to live, and for the first time in a decade, he decided he was not quite ready to die. He walked away from the tactical terminal with the casual, measured stride of a man taking a leisurely stroll before an execution. His two heavily armored guards followed closely, their plasma rifles resting against their chest plates. They were expecting him to make a desperate run for an escape pod. They were not expecting him to turn a simple localized command cipher into a highly weaponized structural hazard. As they passed a massive hexagonal atmospheric scrubber column, Elias casually swiped his cipher against a maintenance node. He did not break his stride. 3 seconds later, the node interpreted the smuggled line of code as a catastrophic pressure failure in the adjacent sector. The heavy pressurized blast doors at both ends of the corridor slammed shut with bone-jarring force, sealing the three of them in a 50-foot stretch of hallway. Before the guards could even raise their weapons to demand an explanation, Elias initiated the secondary command. The atmospheric scrubbers instantly reversed their polarity, venting the oxygen from the sealed corridor directly into space. The air grew terrifyingly thin in a matter of seconds. The guards gripped their throats, their heavy armor completely useless against the sudden vacuum. They dropped their rifles, gasping violently like fish pulled from the ocean. Elias felt his own lungs burn, his vision blurring at the edges. but he had trained for this exact physiological torture in the Black Ops program. He simply held his breath, dropped to one knee, and waited. It took 45 seconds for the guards to lose consciousness and collapse against the obsidian floor. Elias calmly stepped over their bodies, knelt by the manual override panel hidden beneath the scrubber column, and input the sequence Jax had given him. A small, perfectly concealed maintenance hatch hissed open. He slipped inside the dark, claustrophobic crawlspace just as the automated system restored life support to the corridor. He was officially off the grid. The maintenance shafts of the dreadnought were a nightmare of exposed wiring, superheated plasma conduits, and grinding gears. Elias moved through them with terrifying agility, dropping down level after level until he reached the foul-smelling perimeter of the gladiator pens. He tapped a rhythm against the rusted grating of a ventilation shaft overlooking the smuggler's cell block. A moment later, the grating shifted, and the blue-scaled face of Jax appeared in the gloom. The alien grinned, his needle-like teeth reflecting the dim emergency lighting. "I was starting to think you took the Warlord up on his dinner offer and forgot about your new business partner," Jax whispered, hoisting himself into the narrow shaft with surprising grace for a creature with 4 arms. "I had a scheduling conflict," Elias replied flatly. "We need to move. The timeline has accelerated." "Accelerated to what?" Jax asked, brushing a thick layer of industrial grease off his coat. "An automated biosynthetic explosion capable of turning this entire deck into a radioactive cloud of vapor." Elias stated, "We are going to sabotage the main sublight drives. If we can trigger a cascade failure in the magnetic containment fields, the ship's internal sensors will go completely blind. That gives me the cover I need to handle my personal problem, and it gives you the chaos you need to reach the hangar bays." Jax stared at him, his cynical smirk replaced by a look of profound, horrifying realization. "You have a bomb inside you. You are a walking piece of ordnance, and you want to sneak into the most heavily guarded engineering bay in the quadrant." "Yes. I hate you," Jax muttered, shaking his head. "I genuinely hate you. Lead the way." The unlikely duo began their descent. The contrast between them was stark and entirely necessary for their survival. Elias was the silent, lethal instrument, dismantling laser tripwires and silently incapacitating solitary engineer patrols with a single, brutal twist of the neck. Jax was the fast-talking navigator, bypassing highly complex biometric scanners with a spliced datapad and a steady stream of highly inventive, whispered profanity. When they encountered a squad of 4 armored mechanics fixing a damaged coolant line, Elias dropped from the ceiling like a stone, neutralizing 3 of them before they even registered his presence. The 4th mechanic reached for a sidearm, only to find Jax standing behind him. A heavy hydrospanner pressed firmly against the base of his skull. "I would strongly advise against that," Jax whispered cheerfully. "My friend here lacks any semblance of a sense of humor, and I am highly allergic to getting shot." While Elias and Jax carved a quiet path of destruction through the bowels of the flagship, a very different kind of rebellion was brewing on the surface of Ethelgard. Ambassador Lyra Thorne stood in the center of the High Chancellor's private, heavily encrypted data vault. She had used every ounce of her political capital and several highly illegal passcodes to access the Senate's raw tactical feed. The holographic displays around her painted a grim picture of the blockade, but it was the small, blinking green text in the corner of the primary terminal that made her blood run cold. The Zenith protocol had been initiated. The remote detonator was entirely automated, counting down from 60 minutes. The Senate had never intended to let Elias negotiate. They had never intended to use him as a Trojan horse to gather intelligence. They had handed him over to Warlord Vor simply to bypass the dreadnought's heavy exterior shielding. They were going to detonate Elias from the inside, vaporizing the Warlord and wiping out the only living proof of the Senate's darkest sins in one convenient, horrific strike. Lyra gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles turning bone-white. The icy composure she had maintained for years finally shattered. She remembered the flat, dead look in Elias's eyes when she left him in that hangar bay. She had thought she was giving him a purpose, a chance to strike back against a monstrous enemy. Instead, she had delivered him to his own execution. She loved him. It was a terrifying, inconvenient truth she had buried under layers of duty and ambition. But staring at the countdown timer, the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had chosen the Republic over him once before, and it had destroyed his soul. She refused to do it again. Lyra did not hesitate. She deleted her access footprint, turned on her heel, and marched out of the vault. She bypassed her diplomatic transport and headed straight for the classified Black Watch hangars located beneath the Senate spire. The guards recognized her uniform and stepped aside, completely unaware that the esteemed ambassador was in the process of committing high treason. She walked directly to a Nightglaive, an experimental single-seat stealth fighter designed for deep cover insertions. It possessed zero offensive weaponry, but boasted an active camouflage hull capable of slipping past the most advanced sensory nets in the galaxy. Lyra strapped herself into the pilot's seat, her hands flying across the pre-flight controls with practiced precision. She was not a soldier, but she was a survivor who understood exactly how to navigate a hostile system. Ethelgard Control, this is Ambassador Thorne. Lyra lied smoothly into the comms, initiating the launch sequence. I have authorization for a reconnaissance sweep of the enemy flank. Opening silo doors. Before Control could verify her forged clearance, the Nightglaive shot out of the underground hangar, a silent, invisible dart rocketing toward the dark, jagged canopy of Kalen Vor's armada. She was flying into a swarm of killers, completely unarmed, hoping to intercept a bomb that did not want to be saved. Deep within the Dreadnought's engineering sector, Elias clamped a highly volatile magnetic disruptor charge to the primary casing of the sublight drive. He wiped a streak of sweat and grease from his forehead. The oppressive heat of the engine room was suffocating, but it was nothing compared to the fiery clarity burning in his chest. Every second he spent dismantling the Warlord's ship, the cold, dead apathy that had consumed him for years began to crack. He had spent a decade believing he was nothing more than a ghost haunting his own flesh. The Senate had stripped away his humanity, leaving only a weapon. But as he looked at his hands, steady and strong, preparing to plunge a knife into the heart of an empire, he felt an unfamiliar, deeply buried sensation. It was a raw, furious desire to live. He refused to die as a pawn for the politicians who murdered his family. He refused to give Kalen Vor the satisfaction of a clean victory. He wanted to survive. He wanted to tear the detonator from his spine, burn the dreadnought to the ground, and walk out of the ashes purely on his own terms. "Charges are set," Elias said, his voice carrying a new, dangerous edge. "When these go off, the magnetic fields will collapse. The ship will lock down all external communications and internal sensory nets to reroute power to the containment shields, which gives us exactly 4 minutes of total darkness before the manual overrides kick in," Jax calculated, rapidly typing on his stolen datapad. 4 minutes to vanish. "Where exactly are you planning to go, Vance?" "To a maintenance locker," Elias replied, checking the heavy, jagged combat knife he had taken from a fallen guard. "I need a mirror, a sterile surface, and 0 interruptions." Jax swallowed hard, staring at the knife. The smuggler finally understood the horrifying reality of what Elias was about to do to himself. Suddenly, the deck beneath their feet violently lurched. The blaring shriek of a ship-wide general alarm shattered the steady hum of the engines. Red emergency lights washed the engineering bay in the color of fresh blood. "Did you trigger the charges early?" Jax yelled over the deafening sirens. "No," Elias said, his eyes narrowing as he watched a squad of heavily armed shock troops pour onto the catwalk above them. Vor's internal security had found the suffocated guards. The Warlord's game was over, and the hunt had officially begun. The countdown timer buried in Elias's spine ticked past the 30-minute mark. The trap was closing from all sides, and the true test of his survival had only just started. There is a specific kind of clarity that only arrives when the universe decides you have exactly 30 minutes left to live. For Elias Vance, that clarity tasted like copper and raw adrenaline. The shock troops on the catwalk above did not issue a warning or demand surrender. They simply leveled their heavy plasma rifles and opened fire, turning the engineering bay into a lethal cage of crisscrossing red energy. The air superheated instantly, singeing the edges of Elias's uniform as he dove behind a massive coolant manifold, dragging Jax down with him. Elias did not return fire. He reached into his pocket and pressed the crude detonator linked to the magnetic disruptor charges he had just clamped to the sublight drive. The explosion was a contained, terrifying implosion of localized gravity. The heavy casing of the primary drive buckled inward, shattering the magnetic containment fields that regulated the ship's massive power output. The resulting shockwave threw the heavily armored guards violently against the bulkheads. Instantly, the blaring sirens died, the red emergency lights shattered. The entire lower hemisphere of the dreadnought plunged into absolute, impenetrable darkness as the ship's central computer desperately rerouted all available power to prevent a reactor meltdown. "We have 4 minutes of total blindness before the backup generators cycle," Elias stated, his voice perfectly level in the pitch black. "Move." He grabbed the smuggler by the collar of his coat, navigating the labyrinth of the engineering bay entirely by memory and the lingering thermal signatures of the ruptured conduits. They slipped through a series of blast doors just as they began to grind shut on manual overrides, finally sealing themselves inside a cramped, heavily reinforced maintenance locker hidden between 2 primary bulkheads. Elias immediately stripped off his jacket and shirt, tossing them to the floor. The locker was barely large enough for 2 men to stand shoulder to shoulder. He pulled a small, glowing emergency chem light from the wall bracket, snapping it to bathe the tiny room in a sickly yellow glow. He handed it to Jax. "Hold this," Elias commanded, his tone leaving no room for debate. "And do not look away. If I pass out, you need to wake me up. If I die, you take my access cipher and find an escape pod." Jax took the light, his blue scales paling to a pale gray as he watched Elias pick up the jagged, heavy combat knife he had taken from the guard. The smuggler's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. "Vance, tell me you are not about to do what I think you are about to do," Jax stammered, backing against the cold metal wall. "The Alliance detonation signal just breached the dreadnought's outer firewall," Elias replied, his voice taking on a grim, mechanical detachment. He turned his back to Jax, angling his body so he could see the reflection of his own heavily scarred neck in a polished steel panel on the wall. "The core inside my spine is shielded by a biometric failsafe. If I try to remove the explosive, it detonates. But the receiver module that catches the Senate's remote signal is wired slightly higher, just below the second vertebra. I do not need to defuse the bomb. I just need to make it deaf." He did not hesitate. He did not take a breath to steady his nerves. Elias pressed the tip of the cold steel blade against the hardened scar tissue at the base of his skull and pushed. Jax let out a choked gasp, turning his head away, but Elias barked a sharp command, forcing the alien to hold the light steady. The pain was absolute, a blinding, white-hot agony that threatened to sever his consciousness from his body. Blood slicked his grip on the handle, but his hands remained terrifyingly steady. He was no longer fighting Vor or the Alliance, he was fighting his own biology. He used sheer, weaponized spite to keep his vision clear, digging through muscle and sinew until the blade scraped against the hard ceramic casing of the receiver module. With a sickening twist of the blade, Elias hooked the microscopic cluster of synthetic wires connecting the receiver to the explosive core. He severed them in one violent motion. A sharp, metallic click echoed in his own head, followed by a sudden, profound emptiness. The rhythmic, invasive pulsing of the Alliance countdown vanished. The tether was cut. He was no longer the Senate's puppet. Elias pulled the bloody, ruined node from his flesh and dropped it onto the floor. He leaned heavily against the wall, gasping for air, his body trembling violently from the systemic shock. He handed Jax a portable plasma torch from the locker's toolkit. "Cauterize it," Elias rasped, his eyes completely black with pain. Jax did not argue. He ignited the torch and pressed the searing flame directly against the open wound. The smell of burning flesh filled the cramped space. But Elias merely gritted his teeth, refusing to give the universe the satisfaction of a scream. Thousands of miles away, in the cold void of space, a shadow detached itself from the debris field bordering Ethelgard. Ambassador Lyra Thorne pushed the throttle of the Nightglaive stealth fighter to maximum. She watched the tactical display illuminate with the chaotic data pouring from Kaelin Vor's flagship. The Dreadnought's defensive posture was crumbling. The sudden loss of the sublight drives had caused a cascading failure in the overlapping magnetic shields protecting the Armada. Huge gaps were opening in the blockade, blind spots created by the flagship's desperate attempt to stabilize its own core. Lyra gripped the controls, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was flying completely unarmed into the center of the most heavily fortified airspace in galactic history. As she crossed the threshold of the Dreadnought's perimeter, a secondary sensor sweep detected the faint thermal bloom of her engines. Instantly, the dark sky lit up with the brilliant, terrifying streaks of automated point defense fire. Lyra did not panic. The years spent navigating the treacherous, backstabbing political landscape of the Senate had taught her how to survive when completely surrounded by enemies. She threw the agile fighter into a violent, spiraling dive, threading the needle through a barrage of flak that tore through the empty space she had occupied a fraction of a second earlier. She bypassed the heavily guarded primary bays and targeted a small, secondary auxiliary hangar near the engineering decks. She hit the manual release for the landing gear, knowing they would not deploy in time. The Nightglaive smashed into the polished obsidian deck of the hangar, the hull screaming against the metal as it skidded wildly out of control. Sparks showered the bay, illuminating the terrified faces of the few deckhands scrambling for cover. The fighter slammed heavily into a massive cargo bulkhead, the reinforced canopy cracking violently upon impact. Lyra kicked the shattered glass away, drawing her standard-issue diplomatic sidearm. She stepped out of the smoking wreckage, the immaculate ambassador replaced entirely by a woman who had crossed the point of no return. She was a traitor to her government, an invader on a warlord's ship, and she had never felt more alive. Deep within the ship, Elias tied a strip of torn fabric tightly around his neck, concealing the raw, blistered burn of the cauterized wound. He picked up his combat knife, the blade still stained with his own blood, and kicked the locker door open. The 4 minutes were up. The backup generators hummed to life, casting the corridors in a dim, blood-red light. "Where are we going now?" Jax asked, his voice shaking as he stepped out behind Elias. "You cut their leash. We can find a transport and disappear into the outer rim. The Warlord is crippled." "Vor is not crippled. He is angry," Elias corrected, his voice devoid of its former apathy, replaced by a cold, terrifying purpose. "And I have a profound dislike for men who lock people in cages. Follow me." Elias led the smuggler away from the escape pods and directly toward the heavily fortified warden's station overlooking the gladiator pens. The guards stationed inside were frantically trying to reboot the localized security grid, completely oblivious to the predator stalking toward their reinforced glass door. Elias did not bother with stealth. He shattered the biometric lock with a heavy swing of a wrench he had lifted from the locker, kicking the door off its hinges. Before the three guards could even unholster their weapons, Elias crossed the room, a blur of calculated lethal momentum. He dispatched them with terrifying efficiency, utilizing the tight quarters to turn their own armor against them. He stepped over the bodies and approached the primary security console. It was a massive control board that regulated the magnetic locks for every single cell. Holding pen and torture matrix in the lower hemisphere of the flagship, Elias looked at Jax, a dark, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth for the first time in years. "You wanted chaos, Jax," Elias said, his hand hovering over the master override switch. "Let me show you how an empire falls." Elias slammed his hand down on the console. A heavy, mechanized groan echoed through the steel bones of the dreadnought. Instantly, the magnetic fields containing the gladiator pens deactivated. The heavy iron gates swung wide open. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence, a collective breath held by thousands of hardened criminals, political prisoners, and vicious alien beasts who suddenly found themselves staring at open air. Then, the roar began. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated vengeance. 10,000 souls, starved, beaten, and broken by Kalen Vor's cruelty, poured out of their cages like a tidal wave of violence. They swarmed the catwalks, tearing apart the patrolling shock troops with their bare hands, ripping customized plasma rifles from the guards to turn the weapons against the ship itself. The pristine, highly disciplined flagship descended into absolute, bloody anarchy in a matter of minutes. Elias stood at the window of the warden's station, watching the inferno spread through the lower decks. He turned to Jax, tossing the smuggler a localized command cipher. "Take the service elevator to the auxiliary hangar bays," Elias instructed. "Find a ship. Get out of here." "What about you?" Jax asked, catching the cipher. Elias turned away, his gaze lifting toward the ceiling, tracing an invisible path through the miles of steel and armor plating separating him from the pinnacle of the dreadnought. He had a warlord to kill, and for the first time in his life, he was doing it purely for himself. A dreadnought in the throes of full mutiny does not bleed. It simply devours itself from the inside out. For Warlord Kalen Vor, the screams echoing up through the primary ventilation shafts were the sound of his meticulously constructed empire fracturing into a million jagged pieces. For Elias Vance, the chaos was a perfectly orchestrated symphony of cover fire. Elias abandoned the labyrinth of the maintenance shafts, stepping out onto the grand, sweeping staircase that connected the upper officer quarters to the heavily fortified command bridge. The opulent, obsidian-tiled corridors were choked with thick, black smoke and the flashing strobe of emergency hazard lights. Vor had pulled his elite blood guard back to form an impenetrable perimeter around the bridge, leaving the rest of the ship to tear itself apart in the riot. They were expecting a disorganized mob of starving prisoners. They were not expecting a man who had spent a decade operating in the darkest, most lethal corners of the galaxy, now fighting with the terrifying, unleashed fury of a man who had finally chosen to live. Elias did not break his stride as he engaged the first layer of the Warlord's defense. He was a shadow moving through the smoke, a blur of kinetic violence. He slid under a volley of heavy plasma fire, driving his scavenged combat knife upward through the unarmored thigh joint of a towering guard. As the massive soldier collapsed, Elias used the man's falling momentum to rip the heavy repeater rifle from his grip, spinning fluidly to unleash a devastating barrage into the remaining squad. He moved with a deadly improvisational grace, This was no longer the cold, mechanical execution of an alliance order. Every trigger pull, every calculated strike was a conscious assertion of his own agency. He was dismantling Kalen Vor's invincible vanguard not because a corrupt Senate commanded it, but because they stood between him and his absolute freedom. 2 decks below, Ambassador Lyra Thorne was conducting her own masterclass in survival. She had abandoned the ruined stealth fighter in the auxiliary bay, moving upward through the deserted diplomatic suites. She lacked Elias's heavy combat training, but she possessed a mind sharpened on the treacherous whetstone of galactic politics. When she encountered a pair of straggling guards frantically trying to seal a blast door, she did not hesitate or try to hide. Lyra stepped directly into the center of the corridor, smoothing the lapels of her singed diplomatic uniform. She projected an aura of supreme, unshakable authority. "Stand down and drop your weapons by order of the Alliance Senate," Lyra commanded, her voice ringing with the ironclad confidence of a woman used to halting planetary bombardments with a signature. The guards froze, their military discipline warring violently with the sheer absurdity of an Alliance politician appearing out of thin air on a besieged flagship. That single second of cognitive dissonance was all she needed. Lyra raised her stolen sidearm and fired twice with flawless precision, dropping both guards before they could even disengage their weapon safeties. She stepped over their armored bodies, her expression a mask of cold determination, and continued her ascent. Their paths finally converged in the sweeping, vaulted foyer directly beneath the command bridge. Elias was pinned down behind a shattered marble statue of a Vorkasian conqueror. 2 heavily entrenched gunners were chewing the cover to dust with twin-linked rotary cannons, keeping him entirely trapped in the crossfire. He checked the power cell of his stolen rifle, calculating the grim mathematics of a suicidal charge, when the right-side gunner suddenly slumped forward over his weapon. A neat scorch mark burned through the back of his helmet. The rotary cannon spun down into silence. The second gunner whipped around in confusion, only to be struck directly in the chest by a high-yield plasma bolt from the shadows. Elias rose slowly from behind the ruined statue, his rifle raised. The smoke cleared, revealing Lyra standing in the archway. She held her sidearm in a 2-handed grip, her chest heaving, a smear of soot across her cheek. For a profound, suspended moment amidst the blazing ruin of the flagship, the war ceased to exist. Elias stared at the woman who had broken his heart, the woman who had chosen an empire over his family, standing in the heart of a warlord's fortress with a smoking gun. The deadness in his eyes, the icy void that had defined his existence for years, finally shattered completely. "You always were terrible at following evacuation protocols." "Ambassador," Elias said, his voice rasping, a ghost of a genuine, dangerous smile touching his lips. Lyra lowered her weapon slightly, a massive, shuddering breath escaping her lungs as she looked at him. She saw the blood-soaked bandage wrapped tightly around his neck. She understood instantly what he had done to survive. "And you always needed someone to watch your blind spot." "Specialist," Lyra replied, closing the distance between them. There was no time for apologies, no time for the bitter recriminations of their shared past. The survival of the moment demanded absolute synergy. They turned toward the massive, heavily sealed blast doors of the command bridge, moving together not as an ambassador and an assassin, but as 2 halves of a perfectly forged weapon. Elias slapped a heavy breaching charge against the locking mechanism of the primary doors. He grabbed Lyra by the arm, pulling her behind the thick structural pillar of the foyer. The explosion ripped the heavy steel doors from their hinges, sending them crashing into the bridge with the force of a meteor strike. Elias and Lyra stepped through the smoke and into the nerve center of the dreadnought. The bridge was a scene of apocalyptic grandeur. The vast panoramic viewports showed the terrifying beauty of the armada outside, now drifting in chaotic, uncoordinated patterns due to the localized power failures. Red emergency strobes cut through the darkness, illuminating the sparking, ruined consoles of the command pit. The crew had either fled or died in the initial power surge. Only one man remained. Warlord Kalen Vor stood in the center of the raised command dais, fully encased in a terrifying suit of mechanized siege armor. He held a massive, crackling thermal lance, the heavy weapon humming with enough concentrated energy to slice through a heavily armored tank. Vor looked down at the two interlopers, his patrician face twisted in a mask of absolute aristocratic fury. "I offered you a throne, Vance," Vor bellowed, his voice amplified by the suit's external speakers, shaking the deck plating beneath their feet. "I offered you the galaxy on a silver platter, and you chose to die as a rat in the walls for a senate that threw you away. I have a profound distaste for the architecture of your empire," Elias replied, stepping forward, his stolen rifle leveled at the giant. "And I have decided I am done taking orders from men who view the universe from a high chair." Lyra fanned out to the right, raising her sidearm. "It is over. Vor, your ship is burning, your fleet is blind, and the Alliance knows exactly where you are." Vor unleashed a terrifying, booming laugh. He activated a heavily reinforced kinetic shield, a shimmering dome of blue energy snapping into place around his massive frame. "The Alliance is composed of cowards and paper tigers," Vor roared, stepping off the dais with a heavy metallic crash. "And you are just a broken toy pretending to be a man." Vor lunged. Despite the massive bulk of his armor, the warlord moved with terrifying mechanized speed. He swung the thermal lance in a wide, devastating arc. Elias dove beneath the searing blade, feeling the blistering heat singe the hair on the back of his neck. The lance cleaved entirely through a reinforced tactical console, sending a shower of sparks and molten slag across the bridge. Lyra opened fire, unloading her weapon into Vor's back, but the plasma bolt splashed harmlessly against the kinetic shield. Vor ignored her, focusing entirely on the lethal threat sliding across his floor. Elias rolled to his feet, unleashing a sustained burst from his heavy repeater directly into Vor's chest. The shield flared violently, absorbing the impact, but the sheer kinetic force pushed the giant back half a step. Vor snarled, raising his left gauntlet and firing a concussive blast of compressed air. The shockwave caught Elias squarely in the chest, throwing him 20 feet across the room. He slammed brutally against the base of the massive panoramic viewport, the air driven completely from his lungs. He tasted fresh blood, feeling the agonizing crack of at least 2 ribs. Vor stalked toward him, dragging the tip of the thermal lance across the obsidian floor, leaving a glowing trench of molten rock in his wake. "You are nothing, Vance. You possess no loyalties, no beliefs, no attachments. You are a void, and a void cannot fight." Elias struggled to his knees, his vision swimming. He looked past the advancing giant, out through the massive viewport. He saw the chaotic debris of the crippled fleet, the cold void of space, and the shimmering distant blue jewel of Ethelgard. He felt the phantom pain of the severed wires in his neck. Vor was right. For 10 years, Elias had been nothing, but he finally realized that his absolute lack of attachment was not a weakness. It was the ultimate tactical advantage. Vor was weighed down by his need for control, his empire, his massive armor, and his monumental ego. Elias possessed absolutely nothing to lose. Elias locked eyes with Lyra across the ruined bridge. He gave her a single sharp nod. Lyra understood instantly. She holstered her useless sidearm, sprinted toward the sparking ruined remains of the primary environmental controls, and manually engaged the emergency fire suppression system directly above Vor's head. A massive torrent of highly conductive sub-zero chemical foam dumped from the ceiling directly onto the warlord. Vor roared in frustration, the foam temporarily blinding his visor sensors and instantly freezing against the superheated output vents of his kinetic shield generator. The shield flickered, the blue dome sputtering violently as it tried to compensate for the sudden, drastic temperature shift. It was the only opening Elias would ever get. He ignored the agonizing pain in his chest, pushing himself off the floor with explosive, desperate speed. He did not aim for the thickest part of the armor. He sprinted directly at the giant, sliding across the foam-slicked floor, and drove his scavenged combat knife upward, entirely bypassing the failing shield. Elias jammed the heavy steel blade directly into the tiny, unarmored thermal exhaust port situated beneath the armpit of the siege suit. He didn't just stab the Warlord. He drove the knife deep into the suit's internal power manifold, twisting the blade with every ounce of strength he possessed. The suit violently short-circuited. A massive, localized electrical discharge ripped through the armor. The thermal lance overloaded, exploding in Vor's hand. The Warlord convulsed, entirely trapped inside a 2-ton metal coffin that was cooking him from the inside out. He crashed heavily to his knees, his agonizing scream muffled by the heavy helmet, before collapsing face first onto the obsidian floor. The command bridge fell utterly silent, save for the hissing of the chemical foam and the distant muffled sounds of the ship tearing itself apart below. Elias stood over the fallen Warlord, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He reached down to the smoldering armor, grabbed Vor's heavily ringed hand, and forcibly removed the biometric master command cipher from the dead man's gauntlet. He limped toward the central command terminal, wiping the blood from his mouth. Lyra stepped up beside him, her hand gently finding the small of his back, offering a silent, grounding support that he had not felt in a decade. Elias slotted the Warlord's cipher into the primary console. The system flashed green, recognizing its new master. He had the ship, but out there in the dark, the heavily armed remnants of the Warlord's armada were waiting for orders, and a corrupt Senate was waiting for a ghost to detonate. A decapitated snake does not politely retreat. It thrashes blindly in the dirt until its muscles finally understand that the brain is gone. Elias Vance stood before the primary tactical console of the ruined dreadnought, the blood from his neck soaking into the collar of his stolen uniform. Outside the massive, shattered viewports, the iron canopy of Kalen Vor's armada hung in a state of localized confusion. The sudden power failures across the flagship had disrupted their synchronized formations, but they were still a force capable of turning a planet to glass. They simply needed an order. Elias slotted the dead Warlord's biometric cipher deeper into the console port. He bypassed the weapon systems and the helm, slicing directly into the flagship's tight beam communication array. He did not issue a command to stand down. He did not make a grand, theatrical speech demanding their surrender. He simply transmitted a live feed of Kalen Vor's vital signs to every single vessel in the blockade, across 10,000 warships. The bridge crews watched their tactical screens refresh with a flat, continuous red line. The apex predator of the Outer Rim was dead. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely chaotic. Vor had ruled his vast empire purely through the application of terrifying, uncompromising fear. With the architect of that fear lying dead on his own bridge, the fragile alliances holding the armada together instantly evaporated. The captains of the heavy siege cruisers realized their flanks were suddenly exposed to their own ambitious lieutenants. The unified invasion force fractured into 100 self-serving, paranoid factions. Heavy thrusters ignited in a chaotic ballet of cowardice and opportunism. Ships bumped and scraped against one another, their captains violently breaking formation to escape the inevitable power vacuum. The jagged iron sky above the capital world of Ethelgard shattered as dreadnoughts and frigates blindly jumped into hyperspace, fleeing back to the shadows of the rim. The unbreakable blockade dissolved in a matter of minutes. Down on the surface, deep within the heavily fortified subterranean bunkers of the Senate spire. The High Chancellor watched the tactical feed with a mixture of profound relief and absolute, mounting terror. The red dots representing the enemy fleet were vanishing. The planet was saved. But the Chancellor was not cheering. His eyes were locked on a secondary monitor, a highly classified data stream displaying the telemetry for the Zenith protocol. The countdown timer, which should have triggered a catastrophic biosynthetic explosion, was frozen entirely. The signal feed was dead. Elias Vance was alive. He had conquered the most dangerous ship in the galaxy, and he possessed an unpayable debt of vengeance. The Chancellor frantically ordered his generals to scramble the planetary defense fighters, commanding them to vaporize the drifting dreadnought before it could re-engage its engines. He was too late. The strike did not come from a plasma battery. It came from a keyboard. On the bridge of the flagship, Lyra Thorne stepped up beside Elias. She brushed a strand of soot-stained hair from her eyes and placed her hands gracefully over the secondary communication console. She used her supreme diplomatic access codes to slice through the Alliance's heavily encrypted firewalls, treating the planetary defense network with the same calculated ruthlessness she had used to navigate the Senate floor. She targeted the planetary emergency broadcast system, hijacking every single screen, datapad, and towering holographic billboard across Ethelgard and the surrounding core worlds. She did not show the citizens a victory banner. She did not spin a narrative of heroic sacrifice. Lyra showed them the ugly, unvarnished truth. She uploaded the classified black site manifests from Tartarus Station. She streamed the raw, decrypted requisition orders signed directly by the High Chancellor, authorizing the surgical orbital strike on Elias's civilian sector 10 years ago. She broadcast the architectural blueprints for the Zenith Core, providing irrefutable proof that the Senate had intentionally murdered a grieving family to forge a weapon, and then attempted to use that same man as an automated suicide bomber to cover their own grotesque crimes. 70 billion citizens of the Alliance watched in horrified silence as the myth of their benevolent democratic republic burned to the ground in high definition. The Chancellor's aides slowly backed away from him in the bunker, the realization dawning that the furious mob forming outside the spire was no longer worried about an alien warlord. The true monsters had been sitting in the capital all along. Elias watched the data cascade across the massive viewports, the green text reflecting in his dark eyes. The ghosts of his past were finally dragged out of the shadows and thrust into the blinding light of public execution. Justice is rarely a swift gavel. Sometimes, it is simply a very loud, undeniable microphone. The massive dreadnought drifted in the silent void, a bruised, smoking leviathan surrounded by the debris of a broken empire. The bridge was completely quiet, save for the rhythmic humming of the backup life support generators. The red emergency strobes cast long, dancing shadows across the obsidian floor and the fallen armor of Kalen Vor. Lyra turned to Elias. She closed the distance between them, reaching out with a trembling hand. Her fingertips gently brushed the rough, blood-soaked fabric wrapped around the base of his neck. The physical touch sent a phantom jolt through his nervous system. But this time, it was not the agonizing shock of an explosive core. It was the terrifying, exhilarating spark of human connection. It was the warmth of a future he had thoroughly convinced himself was incinerated a decade ago. "They will hunt us," Lyra said softly, her icy blue eyes searching his face for any sign of retreat. "The Senate will completely collapse by morning, but the surviving remnants and the military hardliners will put a bounty on our heads that will bankrupt entire solar systems. We can never go back to Alliance space." Elias looked down at her. The profound, impenetrable deadness that had defined his existence, the localized madness that had protected him from Vor's telepaths, was gone. It had burned away in the heat of his own agency. "I have absolutely no interest in going back," Elias replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. I spent 10 years being told I was a ghost haunting a machine. I think it is time to see what it actually feels like to be alive." He reached out, his heavy, scarred hand wrapping gently around hers. It was a remarkably simple gesture, but for a man who had weaponized his own apathy to survive a nightmare, it was a monumental act of rebellion. He was choosing attachment. He was choosing vulnerability. He was choosing her. Elias turned back to the primary navigation console. The dreadnought was heavily damaged, its sublight drives crippled and its lower decks a war zone of escaped prisoners. But the massive, shielded hyperdrive core remained entirely intact. He bypassed the standard core world trajectories. He did not plot a course for a safe harbor or a hidden rebel outpost. He inputted a string of complex coordinates leading far beyond the charted edges of the outer rim, pointing the bow of the colossal warship directly into the deep, unforgiving, uncharted dark. He engaged the primary sequence. The stars outside the shattered viewport stretched into brilliant, infinite lines of white light, and the dreadnought vanished from the sky, leaving the burning remains of the Alliance behind. A weapon only serves the hand that holds it, right up until the exact moment the weapon learns how to make its own fist. Trauma can forge a person into a terrifying instrument of destruction. A hollow vessel meant entirely for fighting other people's wars. But true power does not lie in the physical ability to tear down an empire or shatter a warlord's armor. True, unyielding power is the absolute courage required to look at the broken, heavily scarred pieces of your own life and decide to build something beautiful anyway. Elias Vance was handed over to the enemy as a ticking bomb with absolutely nothing left to lose. He walked away from the ashes as a man with an entire universe to gain. Thank you so much for exploring the dark edges of the galaxy with me today. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and subscribe for more epic sci-fi adventures. Share this video with someone who loves a good tale of rebellion and redemption. Drop into the comments and leave the word Zenith so I know you made it all the way to the end of the journey. And please hit that hype button so this channel can reach more sci-fi fans exactly like you. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars.